The gray dawn of June 6, 1944, broke over the Normandy coast with a suffocating heaviness, the air already thick with the sulphurous taste of cordite and the salt spray of a churning English Channel. At 0630 hours, the ramps of American landing craft slammed down into the surf of Omaha Beach. And what followed was not a battle in the traditional sense, but an industrial-scale slaughter. Within minutes, the shoreline was transformed into a chaotic abattoir, where men fell by the hundreds, their bodies washing back and forth in the rising crimson tide. Landing craft burned furiously, turning into steel pyres that choked the air with black smoke, while wounded men, weighed down by heavy packs and waterlogged equipment, drowned inches from the safety of the shingle. Combat engineers, tasked with the terrifying job of clearing beach obstacles, were cut down by machine gun fire before they could even prime their charges, their bodies draped over the very steel beams they were sent to destroy. The tanks that had managed to survive the perilous swim to shore sat helpless on the sand, immobilized by minefields or shingle, unable to advance and picking off targets only until they themselves were immolated by German anti-tank rounds. By 0830, 2 hours into the invasion, the situation was so dire, the carnage so absolute, that General Omar Bradley, standing on the deck of the USS Augusta, stared through his binoculars with a growing sense of dread, wondering if the American assault had failed. For a few dark, terrifying moments, the commander of the American First Army considered the unthinkable, abandoning Omaha Beach entirely and diverting the subsequent waves of troops to Utah Beach or the British sectors. The margin between victory and catastrophe had vanished. Yet, just miles away to the east, a fundamentally different reality was unfolding. On Gold Beach, British forces were already 6 kilometers inland, pushing through French villages. On Juno Beach, Canadian troops had penetrated 12 kilometers, achieving the deepest advance of the entire day. On Sword Beach, British infantry had cleared the exits within an hour. The disparity between the American nightmare at Omaha and the Commonwealth's success on the flanks was not a matter of courage. The American soldiers at Omaha displayed a heroism that defied logic. It was not a difference in training, nor was it solely the result of the terrain or the unexpected strength of the German 352nd Division. Though both were significant factors, the critical difference, the variable that saved thousands of lives on the British beaches and was absent at Omaha, was technology. Specifically, it was a menagerie of bizarre, specialized armored vehicles known as Hobart's Funnies, machines designed to clear mines, bridge ditches, and incinerate bunkers. These were vehicles that the British had developed over 2 years of painful trial and error, vehicles they had offered to American commanders, and vehicles that General Bradley and his staff, driven by pride and doctrinal stubbornness, had largely refused to understand the tragedy of Omaha. One must look back not to the planning rooms of 1944, but to the bloody shingle of Dieppe in August 1942. Operation Jubilee, the raid on the French port of Dieppe, by British and Canadian forces, was a catastrophe that served as a grim tuition for the Allies. Of the 6,000 men who went ashore, 3,600 became casualties. The Churchill tanks sent to support the infantry became steel coffins. They could not gain traction on the loose chert beach, their tracks spinning uselessly as they were methodically picked apart by German anti-tank gunners. Engineers attempting to blow gaps in the seawall were massacred, unable to work under the withering hail of fire. Standard armor and conventional infantry tactics had slammed into the Atlantic wall and shattered. The lesson was written in blood. Against fortified beach defenses, gallantry was insufficient. Lord Mountbatten later claimed that D-Day was won on the beaches of Dieppe, meaning that the disaster had stripped away the delusions of the Allied command. They realized that if they were to return to France, they needed entirely new capabilities. They needed machines that could swim, flail, bridge, and burn. The man resurrected to solve this impossible engineering puzzle was Major General Percy Hobart, a figure as unconventional as the machines he would create. In 1940, Hobart was a pariah, a 55-year-old retired officer serving as a lance corporal in the Home Guard, drilling with a pike in the Cotswolds village of Chipping Campbell. Despite having been one of the brilliant minds behind the pre-war theory of mobile armored warfare, and the creator of Egypt's desert rats, his abrasive personality and unorthodox ideas had alienated the British military establishment. It took the personal intervention of Winston Churchill, who had read an article decrying the waste of Hobart's talents, to bring him back. Churchill, who delighted in mechanical innovation, overruled the Chief of Imperial General Staff and gave Hobart a mandate to create a specialized armored division. Hobart established the 79th Armored Division, transforming it into a unique military entity, a think tank that would go to war. His directive was revolutionary in its egalitarianism, encouraging suggestions from all ranks. He understood that in the business of survival, a private soldier might see a solution that a general would miss. Hobart established a training center codenamed Crushton in Suffolk, where his engineers built exact replicas of German beach defenses. They studied the failures of Dieppe with forensic intensity and designed a specific vehicle to counter every obstacle the Germans had constructed. The result was a collection of oddities that traditionalists mocked as funnies. There was the Sherman Crab, a standard tank fitted with a rotating drum and heavy chains that flailed the ground ahead of it, detonating mines and cutting barbed wire. There was the Churchill Avra, or Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, a swimming tank fitted with a petard mortar that fired a 29-pound explosive charge, nicknamed the Flying Dustbin, capable of cracking concrete bunkers that naval gunfire couldn't touch. There was the Crocodile, a flame-throwing tank that could project a stream of liquid fire over 100 yards, a weapon of such psychological terror that its mere presence often caused German garrisons to surrender. There were bridge layers, ram carriers, and bob-and tanks that laid down carpet over soft sand. By early 1944, Hobart had not just built vehicles, he had created an entire assault system, a combined arms choreography where flails cleared the path, AVREs smashed the obstacles, and crocodiles broke the enemy's will. The tragedy of Omaha began to take shape in the early months of 1944, when this technology was presented to the American High Command. On January 27th and again on February 11th, General Eisenhower and General Bradley watched demonstrations of Hobart's machines. Eisenhower was immediately impressed, particularly by the duplex-drive DD amphibious tanks, and ordered hundreds of them. However, he left the decision regarding the other Funnies, the Flails, the flamethrowers, and the demolition tanks to Bradley. The British, fully committed to the alliance, offered the Americans a third of all the specialized vehicles they were producing, essentially a half share of everything in their arsenal. It was a blank check for innovation. Yet, Bradley and his staff hesitated. While they accepted the DD swimming tanks and a handful of dozer blades, they declined the crabs, the crocodiles, and the avian. The reasons were a complex cocktail of legitimate logistical concerns and hubristic national pride. Bradley's staff argued that introducing British Churchill tanks would complicate supply chains, requiring different parts and ammunition. They viewed the specialized armor as gimmicky, believing that the battle would be won by infantry supported by overwhelming naval and aerial firepower. As one staff officer bluntly put it later, the general didn't like the Funnies. He saw it as an infantryman's battle, and besides, the tanks were British. He thought the Americans should do it on our own. That decision to do it on our own relied on a fire support plan that disintegrated within minutes of The plan called for 13,000 bombs to be dropped by 450 heavy bombers to pulverize the beach defenses, followed by a massive naval bombardment. But on the morning of June 6, low cloud cover forced the bombers to delay their releases to avoid hitting the invasion fleet. The result was that 13,000 bombs fell harmlessly 3 to 5 miles inland, leaving the German minefields, bunkers, and trenches completely intact. The naval bombardment, limited to 40 minutes to preserve surprise, was largely ineffective against the hardened concrete of the Atlantic Wall. When the American infantry hit the beach, they were not walking into a pulverized ruin, but into the kill zones of the fully operational German 352nd Infantry Division. This was not the static garrison of old men and conscripts Allied intelligence had expected, but a veteran unit stiffened by survivors of the Eastern Front, soldiers who knew how to fight and had been ordered never to give ground. The unfolding disaster was compounded by the failure of the only specialized armor. The Americans had accepted the DD tanks. At Omaha, the decision was made to launch these swimming tanks from 5,000 to 6,000 yards offshore, into seas that were churning with waves far higher than the canvas screens were designed to handle. It was a death sentence for the crews. Of the 32 tanks launched by the 741st Tank Battalion, 27 sank immediately, plunging to the bottom of the channel like stones. Men drowned, trapped inside their steel hulls. Others were dragged under by the weight of their gear. The infantry was left effectively without the Sherman Crabs, 2 flail paths through the minefields. The job of clearing the way fell to the human engineers of the Navy Combat Demolition Units and Army Engineer Battalions. These men, carrying explosives and wire cutters, had to work completely exposed on the open beach, under the concentrated fire of machine guns and mortar. The result was a massacre. Casualty rates for the demolition units soared to over 50%. They died trying to blow gaps in obstacles that a flailed tank could have cleared in minutes. The specific horror of that morning is best understood through the fate of Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, the Bedford Boys. These men, National Guardsmen from the small town of Bedford, Virginia, landed at Dog Green Sector at 0630. Within 7 minutes, the company essentially ceased to exist as a fighting unit. As the ramps dropped, they were met with a wall of lead. Captain Taylor Fellers, suffering from a sinus infection but determined to lead his neighbors, was killed instantly. The beach became a chaotic mix of screams and explosions. Brothers watched brothers die. The Stevens twins had planned to shake hands on the beach. Ray was killed before he reached the sand. By the time the remnants of the company regrouped, 96% of the unit were casualties. 19 boys from Bedford died in those first few minutes. They died because the suppression fire had failed, because there was no armor to shield them, and because the obstacles had not been cleared. They were infantrymen thrown against concrete and steel, without the tools to breach them. Contrast this with the experience on Gold Beach. where the British 50th Division landed with the full support of Hobart's 79th Armored Division. There, the sequence of battle was entirely different. The Funnies led the way. Sherman crabs churning the sand with their flails, beat a path through the minefields, detonating explosives safely away from the infantry. Behind them came the AVREs, their mortar cracking open the concrete pillboxes that guarded the exits. When a strong point refused to yield, the crocodiles rolled forward, spewing flame and terror, forcing mass surrenders often without a shot being fired. On Gold Beach, the exits were cleared by 0930. The casualties for the entire day were roughly 400 men out. Of 25,000 landed, at Omaha, the casualties were 2,400. The Americans suffered 6 times the losses to achieve a beachhead that was a fraction of the depth. On Juno Beach, Canadian forces faced heavy resistance and rough seas that delayed their landing. But because they employed the Funnies, they managed to penetrate further inland than any other Allied force that day. The difference was not the fighting spirit of the men, but the mechanical advantages they were given. The psychological impact of the specialized armor cannot be overstated. German accounts from the British sector speak of the sheer terror induced by these machines. Private Martin, I am a German defender on Gold Beach, later recalled watching a Sherman crab emerge from the surf. He described the deafening noise of the chains beating the earth, the clouds of dust, and the sight of mines exploding harmlessly under the flails. To the German defenders who were prepared for a conventional infantry assault, these monsters were the stuff of nightmares. The crocodile flamethrowers were even more devastating. The mere sight of the armored trailer and the flame gun was often enough to break the morale of seasoned troops. By refusing these weapons, the American command allowed the Germans at Omaha to fight the battle on their own terms, matching machine guns and artillery against flesh and blood, a contest that inevitably favored the defender. The battle for Omaha was eventually won, but not by the plan, and certainly not by the technology. It was won by the raw, desperate courage of individuals who realized that staying on the beach meant death. It was won by men like Lieutenant Jimmy Monteith, who walked through minefields to guide the few surviving tanks to firing positions, banging on their hulls with his fists to get their attention before being killed. It was won by technician 5th grade John Pin, a professional baseball player before the war, who, despite having half his face sheared off by shrapnel, refused medical attention to assemble vital radio equipment until a second burst of machine gun fire killed him. It was won by the destroyers of the U.S. Navy, whose captains risked grounding their ships to sail within hundreds of yards of the shore, delivering point-blank fire support into the German bunkers. The victory at Omaha was a triumph of the human spirit over a catastrophic failure of preparation and doctrine. In the aftermath, the assessment was brutal. General Eisenhower, writing after the war, admitted that the comparatively light casualties on the British beaches were in large measure due to the success of the novel mechanical which were employed. He explicitly noted that it was doubtful the assault could have succeeded without them, a statement that casts a long, dark shadow over the decision to forego them at Omaha. The historical consensus, solidified by Chester Wilmot's influential work, The Struggle for Europe, is that American pride and a disdain for British gadgets cost thousands of lives. The argument that logistical compatibility with the Churchill chassis was a deal-breaker rings hollow when one considers that the Sherman Crab was based on the American M4 chassis, a vehicle the U.S. Army had in abundance. The refusal was not just logistical, it was cultural. It was a belief that American firepower and American grit would be enough. The lessons of Omaha were eventually learned, though it took decades for the institutional memory to fully crystallize. The U.S. Army did make limited use of mine flails later in the European campaign, but it wasn't until the Vietnam War that the concept of specialized combat engineering vehicles was systematically adopted with the Rome plows. In the modern era, the lineage of Hobart's Funnies is undeniable. The M1150 assault breacher vehicle, a 72-ton beast based on the Abrams tank chassis and equipped with mine plows and line charges, is the direct spiritual successor to the vehicles of the 79th Armored Division. When US Marines used these vehicles to clear paths through Taliban minefields in Afghanistan in 2010, they were validating the vision of Percy Hobart. They were operating on the principle that specialized obstacles require specialized solutions, and that exposing human engineers to enemy fire, when a machine can do the job, is a moral failure. The 2,400 casualties at Omaha Beach stand as a permanent, somber monument to the cost of ignoring innovation. While it is true that the terrain at Omaha was uniquely difficult and the German defense unexpectedly fierce, the comparison with the British and Canadian sectors is inescapable. The technological gap between the forces was a choice, not an inevitability. From the disaster at Dieppe, the British had distilled a new way of war, one that prioritized the lives of their soldiers by fielding machines to take the brunt of the danger. The Americans, in their drive for independence and reliance on traditional doctrine, missed that pivot. The result was that while British troops were brewing tea in French villages miles inland, American troops were still fighting for every inch of the blood-soaked sand at the water's edge. Ultimately, the story of D-Day is not just a story of liberation, but a study in the consequences of command decisions. General Bradley, shaken by the carnage, later wrote that they had gone against Omaha with a thin margin of safety. In reality, there was no margin. The plan had failed before the first boot hit the sand. What saved the invasion was the refusal of the American soldier to accept defeat, even when stripped of the tools he should have had. But the ghosts of the Bedford boys, and the thousands of others who bled out on the wire and the shingle, ask a difficult question of history. They ask why gallantry was forced to replace technology, and why the lessons learned in the blood of Dieppe had to be relearned in the blood of Omaha. It is a testament to the fact that in war, intellectual humility and the willingness to accept help even in the form of strange, ungainly British tanks can be the difference between a calculated victory and a Pyrrhic one. The legacy of Percy Hobart is that he saw the battlefield not just as a test of will, but as a problem to be solved, ensuring that when gallantry was required, it was not wasted in vain against steel and concrete that a machine could have defeated.